June 28, 1941, Kharkov, eastern Ukraine. The night was alive with steel. Engines roared against the dark, echoing through the factory yards. Sparks fell from cranes dismantling machines older than the war itself. Men worked without pause, shadows flashing under floodlights. The order had come 2 days earlier: evacuate everything. Every bolt, every press, every ton of iron must move east. The Germans were closing fast. The city trembled with the sound of its own heartbeat, locomotives screaming under weight that they were never built to carry. Wind cut through open rail cars. Women wrapped machine parts in blankets as if protecting children. The smell of oil mixed with frost and smoke. No one spoke of fear. There was no time left to name it. A boy watched his father climb into a cab. "Keep it running," the foreman shouted through the steam. And so began the largest industrial migration in human history. 50 million tons of equipment, 10 million workers, and a single idea. If the factories could move, the war could go on. Records from the Soviet Commissariat describe it as Operation Relocation. But to those who lived it, it was simply survival on rails. Workshops became cargo, assembly lines became trains, and whole cities rolled eastward into the night. The air carried the rhythm of bolts striking steel, each clang a heartbeat of defiance, each gust of wind a reminder Moscow still stood for now. And in the dark, every worker carried the same question: could industry outrun the Wehrmacht? Freight yards glowed like burning horizons. Wagons stretched for miles, carrying turbines, forges, and dreams. Engines hissed beneath the weight of locomotives chained together. Even the stars seemed to move with them, eastward into the steppe. A machinist named Alexei left a note pinned to a wall: "Don't forget the wrench in Bay 3. We'll need it again." When the wall fell to rubble weeks later, the note remained, fused in soot, perfectly legible, a relic of faith in continuity. The trains moved through fog that smelled of coal and winter. Each station farther east meant one more night of life. Children slept beside lathes and gear wheels. Mothers boiled water in tin cans, using shavings for fuel. The war no longer fought in trenches. It was fought in motion. By July's first dawn, Kharkov stood silent. Only the echo of hammer blows drifted across empty yards. The last locomotive whistled once, a long, mournful cry swallowed by distance. Records indicate 1-3 factories began relocation that summer. Half would never return to their original cities. But from their movement rose the backbone of Soviet armor. Workshops on wheels, assembly lines on the run. In one freight car, engineers marked blueprints under a flickering lamp. Their hands blackened with oil, their breath visible in the cold. They drew the outline of a new tank, simple, rugged, fast to produce. They called it T-34. Silence followed the rails as night fell again. Frost gathered on the metal doors. Inside, the workers slept in shifts, dreaming of furnaces that would soon burn again, farther east, beyond the reach of German bombers. The hum of the rails became a lullaby. Smoke trailed behind like a living memory. And for the first time in history, a nation carried its industry on its back. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Urals waited, cold, vast, untouched. There, the Soviets would build new cities of iron, and in their foundries shapen the weapons that would one day push back west. The wind still howled across the steppe. Steam rose from the engines like breath and prayer, and as the last light flickered across the train yard, the war, for them, had already changed shape. October 1941. Somewhere east of the Volga. The nights grew longer. Frost settled on the roofs of rail cars like fine ash. Each sunrise revealed a new horizon, endless plains, endless waiting. And through it all, the convoys of steel kept moving. Engines coughed in the cold. Wheels squealed against frozen tracks. At sidings, men shoveled snow from rails by hand. No maps, no certainty, only the east. By autumn, whole cities existed in transit. Kuibyshev, Sverdlovsk, Chelyabinsk, names whispered like promises. Every station became a frontier, every warehouse a home. Factories disassembled in Ukraine reappeared weeks later as skeletons of steel beneath the Urals. The reports call it the relocation miracle. But there was nothing miraculous about it, only exhaustion and faith. Records from the Soviet State Committee list over 100 industrial plants rebuilt while bombs still fell on Moscow. Each plant was a new artery in a body that refused to die. Wind lashed the open cars. Women worked in gloves stiff with frost. Children carried bolts and bearings too heavy for their arms. A woman named Irina wrote in her logbook, Train 47, 168 cars. Cargo, press turbines, lathes. Human cargo, 312 souls. She underlined the last word twice. At night, they burned grease and scraps of paper for heat. Flames flickered against the metal walls, dancing over faces hollowed by hunger. Yet the sound of hammers never stopped. Even moving, they built. Even freezing, they worked. A young welder recalled hearing the same rhythm every night, the clang of wrenches echoing from train to train, a metallic heartbeat carrying across the darkness. He said it reminded him that somewhere behind them, cities still burned, and ahead, new ones waited to be born. When the first snow came, the steppe turned white as bone. Locomotives vanished into blizzards, only their whistles left behind. Each whistle marked another machine saved from the ruins of the West. Another piece of the Soviet arsenal reborn in exile. Inside one freight car, the engineers argued softly. Blueprints unrolled across the floorboards. Condensation dripped from the ceiling, smearing the ink. Someone muttered, "We must design for movement, a factory that never stops." No one laughed. It became the design philosophy of survival. And so the idea took form, a factory within a train, not a metaphor, but reality. Workshops mounted on flatbeds, forges, presses, and assembly lines that could operate while the convoy moved. A living organism of iron and smoke. Records indicate the first mobile plant was assembled outside Magnitogorsk in late October. It produced small engine parts during transport, its output measured in handfuls. But it proved the concept. Industry itself could move faster than war. The sound of pistons replaced the sound of sirens. The smoke of locomotives replaced the smoke of burning cities. The nation had not escaped destruction. It had transformed it. Every dawn felt borrowed. Every night felt earned. And in that fragile rhythm between motion and stillness, a new kind of warfare began. Not of guns, but of gears, rails, and willpower. One conductor described seeing light spill from a dozen rail cars at once, a moving constellation of furnaces glowing under snowfall. He said it looked like a train pulling the sun itself. By November, the ground froze hard as iron. Engines groaned beneath snowdrifts. Couplings snapped from cold. But still, the caravans moved. Not forward toward glory, but eastward, toward endurance. Smoke drifted through the sky like long ribbons of memory. Wind cut between the cars, singing low against the metal. Somewhere far ahead, the Urals rose from the horizon, a promise of shelter, a shape in the blizzard. For the men and women aboard, the rails had become more than transport. They were lifelines, connecting past to survival. Each mile carried away another piece of the old world. Each wheel turn forged the next. As dusk fell over the steppe, the factory trains disappeared into snowfall, a line of moving shadows, a civilization on rails, breathing smoke and hope into the endless white. And in the quiet that followed, only the hum of steel remained, steady, defiant, alive. December 1941. The Ural Mountains. The air burned cold enough to slice breath in two. Snow fell thick over the rail yards, burying half-unloaded machines. Engines sat frozen mid-motion, steel wheels locked by ice. And yet, within the blizzard, work continued. Magnitogorsk, once a mining outpost, now roared with new life. Every flat field had become a foundation. Every rail spur, a lifeline. What had been wilderness was now the heartbeat of a nation in exile. The wind howled through unfinished walls. Flames from open furnaces rose against the snow. Men hammered beams into frozen ground. sparks flying into white night. Each impact echoed off the mountains like artillery. Records note the temperature reached -35. Bolts shattered from cold, diesel thickened to paste. Workers tied rags around their faces, their eyelashes crusted with frost, their breath clouding like smoke from the furnaces themselves. By early January, the first production lines took shape. No roofs, no insulation, just skeletal frames and raw determination. Engines from Kiev, presses from Leningrad, blueprints from Kharkov, a nation stitched back together in iron and silence. Every factory worker became a builder. Every builder, a soldier without a rifle. They labored 12 hours, sometimes 16. Those who collapsed were covered with canvas and carried aside. The line never stopped. A metallurgist named Mikhail recorded one note in his log: steel batch Na-12, imperfect mix but serviceable for armor. It was the first usable plate forged at Magnitogorsk. The next day he wrote nothing. He had frozen at his station before dawn. His colleagues did not leave their posts. They melted snow for water, heated by the same furnace that took him. That steel would later coat the hull of a T-34. His handwriting, found in the logbook, was used to mark its serial number. The factory came alive as if it had lungs. Pistons thudded in rhythm. Wheels screeched over new rails. Voices shouted over steam and wind. No one spoke of victory, only of keeping the fire burning one more night. The sound of war arrived not through explosions, but through the hammering of rivets. Somewhere deep inside the sheds, engines began to rumble. The first tanks assembled since the evacuation. Unpainted, raw, and imperfect, they rolled from open platforms into the snow. Their tracks left dark scars in the white earth. A report dated February 1942 reads, "Output, 25 tanks per week. Conditions, extreme. Morale, unbroken." Those numbers meant survival, not success. But survival was all that mattered. Between shifts, workers rested inside cargo cars. They slept beside the same machines they built, their dreams filled with the sound of gears and wind. One woman later recalled, "The trains no longer moved, but we did." By February's end, the horizon glowed red each night. The Urals were no longer silent. They had become the forge of the East. From this, snowbound city would come over half the Soviet Union's armor for the rest of the war. Yet beyond production, something deeper had begun, a change in how a nation understood itself. Industry was no longer a place, but a living thing that could adapt, endure, and fight. Smoke drifted upward, merging with low clouds. Ash settled like gray snow on every face, every tool, every hope. And through that haze, the factory's rhythm continued, steady, relentless, immortal. One train whistle pierced the storm, a long, echoing note. It carried across the steppe, fading into the dark as if calling to the next convoy still on the way. The moving factories had found their resting place, but the movement, the idea, would never stop. March 1942. The Urals, east of Magnitogorsk. The blizzards began to ease. The snow, once endless, turned gray with soot. Smoke from new chimneys rose straight into the pale sky, the first sign of spring and of order returning to chaos. The moving factories had become something else now. Rows of rail cars stood coupled in formation, not to transport machines, but to be machines. Workshops, forges, press units, all bolted directly to the trains. Inside them, the war changed tempo. The world outside remained frozen and distant, but within those rail cars, hammers sang. Iron plates clanged like bells in prayer. A Soviet engineer, Sergei Fedorenko, described the scene. "Each carriage a lung, each piston a heartbeat. We built tanks while the rails still trembled beneath us." This was the miracle of motion, factories that breathed, traveled, and produced in rhythm with the earth beneath their wheels. They called it the armored train plant. No walls, no roof, just locomotives, smoke, and defiance. Blueprints were passed hand to hand like contraband. Sparks lit the narrow corridors. Lathes turned even as the cars jolted forward. A worker might feel the train curve, but the drill never stopped turning. Outside, the wind howled through the steppe. carrying the sound of distant artillery from the west. But here, there was another kind of thunder, the clatter of bolts, the hiss of molten steel poured into new molds. Reports from the Ural Tank Plant Committee record the first output of this mobile assembly line, 4 tank hulls completed while in motion, a 5th assembled at a siding near Zlatoust. The feat was never filmed, but every witness swore the ground itself seemed to move with the machines. Each car carried a fragment of production, foundry in the first, riveting in the second, assembly in the third, final checks in the fourth. By the time the convoy reached the next junction, a T-34 rolled out of the rear platform. The process had no blueprint. It existed only in memory and rhythm. The coordination of men who had worked together since Kharkov, their tools scarred but still steady. One mechanic marked each tank with a chalk symbol, a small circle crossed by 2 lines. No one asked why. Later, historians would find the same mark on tanks that fought at Kursk and on wrecks found deep in Poland. His hand had traveled farther than he ever would. The trains became living things. Steam bled through their joints, rivets rattled in harmony with the rails. Even the smoke seemed to pulse, black, white, black again, like a breathing giant in the fog. By May, these convoys had multiplied. Some called them ghost factories, others iron caravans. To the soldiers at the front, they were salvation made of steel and speed. A young officer recalled seeing one arrive near the Oka River. He wrote, "We thought it was a supply train, but from its rear came tanks, already painted, engines running. It was as if the earth had given birth to armor." Magnitogorsk and Chelyabinsk soon synchronized their output. Every movement timed by telegraph, every shipment aligned by whistle code. No speeches, no ceremonies, only the rhythm of production. And beneath that rhythm, an invisible truth emerged. The Soviet war effort was no longer centered in cities. It was alive in the spaces between them, in the rails, the wind, the unbroken will of motion. When dusk fell, the trains continued east to reload. Their trails glowed in the dark, sparks raining from the couplings. Snowmelt hissed beneath the wheels. The night filled again with the hum of machinery. One worker, unnamed, wrote a single line in grease on a car door: "Let the train sleep only when the war sleeps." The door was never cleaned. When the train was later scrapped in 1946, that line remained, etched deep into the steel. The moving factory had become more than invention. It was a living metaphor, a nation that refused stillness, a people whose endurance became their weapon. Outside, thunder rolled from the west. Another campaign had begun. And from within the smoke of the Urals, the answer rolled forward on tracks of iron and belief. June 1942, Chelyabinsk, southern Urals. The smoke no longer drifted. It hung like a ceiling. Heat shimmered above the rail yards where trains stood wheel to wheel, 1,000 locomotives breathing together. The east had become a single lung of fire. Chelyabinsk was no longer a city in any human sense. It was a living organism, molten, mechanical, unending. The locals called it Tankograd, a place where every sound, every light, every heartbeat belonged to war. Engines thundered through the night. Sparks rained down like comets. The air was thick with the scent of oil and hot steel. Even the snow that lingered in shadows turned gray with soot. From every direction came freight cars loaded with promise and ruin. Kazan sent castings, Perm sent engines, Magnitogorsk sent armor plate. The rails converged like arteries toward one heart. Chelyabinsk Tractor Works, reborn as the largest tank plant on Earth. Records show production began that June with astonishing rhythm. 3 T-34s a day, then 5, then 8. By autumn, the line produced tanks faster than German intelligence could believe. Inside the foundries, men worked stripped to the waist, their faces blackened, their eyes burning in the glow. Women operated cranes, hauling turrets overhead like planets suspended in orbit. Every clang was an oath, unspoken but shared. The machinery sang a new hymn of defiance. Engines roared, drills screamed, and beneath it all, the deep metallic heartbeat of the presses. To the untrained ear, it was chaos. To those who lived it, it was rhythm. A national pulse that kept the war alive. Children carried rivets in wooden boxes. Old men swept sparks from under the wheels. Between shifts, workers slept on benches beside still warm armor plates. They dreamed not of victory, only of completion. A worker named Zenaida wrote home, "We build with hands that no longer feel, but our hearts remember every soldier who will ride this steel." Her letter never arrived. It was found later, fused to a crate that reached Stalingrad instead. Tankograd operated day and night without silence. There was no dawn, no disk, only degrees of light filtered through smoke. A whistle marked the end of shifts, but no one truly stopped. Momentum had become faith. Statistics from Soviet archives record 18,000 tanks produced in 1942 alone, each one traced back to these moving workshops, now anchored in the Urals. Every machine bore the lineage of evacuation, endurance, and motion. A soldier visiting the plant remembered, the ground trembled. You could feel the war being born beneath your boots. He carried that memory to Kursk the next year, where hundreds of those same tanks turned the tide of battle. Yet Tankograd was more than industry. It was an act of resurrection, a place where ruins of the West found new purpose in the East, where loss transformed into steel. At the plant's edge, a small chapel had survived the reconstruction. Its bells, melted down for armor, its cross replaced with a red star of welded iron. Each morning, a worker hung a single gear tooth there, a silent prayer for whoever would drive the next tank out of the gates. By late summer, the trains returned westward again, flat cars heavy with T-34s and KV-1s, their tracks gleaming, their hulls marked with chalk names: Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin. One day, steam rose from the wheels as if the trains themselves exhaled courage. Engines bellowed under load, their smoke blending into the same gray sky that had followed them since Kharkov. The wind carried iron dust across the steppe. Ash settled on the river like black snow, and somewhere deep within the plant, a bell tone struck metal, sharp, clear, final. That sound meant another tank had been born, another chance sent west, another heartbeat in the rhythm of survival. For those who built them, there was no thought of glory, only the motion of hands, the echo of steel, and the quiet certainty that the rails beneath them still led home, even if they never saw it again. October 1942, Tankograd, Urals. The summer fires had cooled, but the air still trembled. Every gust carried the metallic taste of war. Leaves turned red with soot instead of season, and the night sky glowed faintly. Not from stars, but furnaces. Production no longer meant speed alone. Now came refinement, endurance. Engines must survive the mud of Stalingrad, the frost of the dawn, the hunger of men who had nothing left but motion. The design bureau moved into a converted rail car near the main line. Inside, engineers worked under kerosene lamps, their breath visible in the cold. Blueprints curled at the edges, smudged by oil and frostbitten fingers. A senior engineer, Dmitry Ostakov, once said, "We no longer build tanks, we build time." Each bolt, each weld, meant one more day the front would hold. The equation of survival had become mechanical. Reports from the Central Design Committee note that over 30% of engines failed in the field that summer. The cause? Sand, water, fatigue. The solution? An impossible schedule of improvement. No testing grounds, no rest, no peace. So they tested on the rails. Engines bolted to flat cars, revved as the train thundered across the Urals. Oil sprayed across the snow, and the smell of burning fuel mingled with winter air. They learned by vibration, by instinct, by faith. At night, the test trains stopped only to change crews. Locomotive whistles marked each shift like a clock of steel. Each burst of sound echoed through valleys, a rhythm of innovation beating in the dark. In the sheds, women reassembled carburetors with sewing needles. Children polished pistons smaller than their fists. A boy named Yura marked each finished engine with a white stripe of chalk. He said it was for luck. By the end of 1942, thousands bore his mark. The noise inside the plant was beyond human tolerance. Hammers, presses, turbines, an unending chorus of effort. Yet within that chaos lived precision, a strange harmony that could only exist where failure was unthinkable. The Soviets began calling these plants the iron lungs. They fed the front with breath and blood made of metal. Each T-34 engine carried within it a little of the Urals wind and the rhythm of the rails. One officer who inspected the convoys wrote, "The tanks arrived smelling of coal and smoke, as if the earth itself forged them." He wasn't wrong. Beyond the walls, winter returned early. Snow fell into the open foundries, melting on red-hot steel. Men wiped their faces with rags soaked in oil and went back to work. Inside one of the mobile workshops, a machinist carved a line into the door with a screwdriver. Every breath is a revolution. No one erased it. No one needed to. By November, Chelyabinsk and Nizhny Tagil were producing nearly 1,000 tanks a month. The numbers staggered even Stalin. He called it a victory of endurance. But to those on the factory floor, it was simply Tuesday. Each day began with the same sound. A single bell struck twice. The signal for steam pressure, for engines to turn, for the foundry floor to awaken. Even when power failed, men hand-cranked the presses by torchlight. Even when food ran out, they shared melted snow from radiator pipes. The machines never stopped long enough to cool. Somewhere far to the west, the tanks carrying these new engines began to reach the Volga. At Stalingrad, they fought street by street, their engines choking on smoke and dust, but never stopping. In that frozen hell, those who survived said the tanks seemed to breathe, as if the Urals themselves whispered through the pistons, "Keep moving." And when the river finally froze, and the last German offensive stalled, the sound of the engines still echoed through the night, a deep, steady pulse that no bomb could silence. The war had turned, the factories had endured, and somewhere in the endless snow, the first hint of victory began to stir, quiet, unseen, inevitable. January 1943, west bank of the Volga River. The city was ash and silence. The wind carried smoke that smelled of burnt brick and iron. Through the haze, Soviet armor crawled forward, tanks born from the Urals, scarred but unbroken. Their engines coughed like living things. Steam rose from shattered hulls, blending with the frost that clung to every edge of metal. Some still bore chalk marks from Tankograd, circles, stripes, names half erased by war. Among them, a T-34 with a white stripe across its turret, a faint signature of Yura's hand from Chelyabinsk. No one here knew who Yura was, but every man who rode inside that tank owed him a heartbeat. The air was thick with dust and whispers. German voices still echoed from cellars. Soviet shouts answered through ruins. Between them, only wind. It swept through the bones of the city like a memory of movement. From a distance, the armor advance looked like machinery rising from the ground. Engines growled beneath clouds of snow, tracks grinding over rubble that once was homes. No songs, no speeches, only the rhythm of metal fulfilling its promise. A Red Army report from January 30th lists 105 operational tanks within the city limits, 68 of them newly arrived from the Urals. Each traveled nearly 2,000 kilometers to get here, carried by trains born in motion, reborn in war. Inside the tanks, crews worked in deafening noise. Steel screamed against concrete. The smell of oil and cordite filled every breath. Yet, amid the chaos, they trusted the machines completely. Engines built by hands they would never see, hands that had frozen, burned, endured. In one letter found after the battle, a gunner wrote home, "Our tank was built by ghosts. It hums like it knows where it came from." He never sent the letter. It was recovered from the pocket of a uniform buried in snow. Above the city, the sky changed color, gray at dawn, red by dusk, a palette of survival. And when the final German transmissions broke off, the silence felt heavier than any explosion. At Tankograd, they learned of victory through static-filled radio. No cheers, just a long exhale of smoke and fatigue. A woman leaned against a press machine and whispered, "He's come home?" No one asked who. The celebration was mechanical. Engines kept running, Shifts continued. The war had not ended, only shifted west. But something had changed within those factories. The myth of motion, the idea that industry could outpace destruction, was now proven. The trains had carried not just machines, but a nation's endurance made tangible. That winter, the temperature in Chelyabinsk dropped to -40. Furnaces burned hotter than ever. Outside, snow drifted high against the factory walls. Inside, the air shimmered with heat and pride. Posters appeared above the assembly lines. Stalingrad has answered, now answer Stalingrad. Each worker read it and simply went back to work. No, slogans were needed. They understood. Every tank forged after that winter carried the same spirit, metal tempered by faith, engines tuned to memory. Each one a moving monument to those who built in darkness and believed light would follow. In Stalingrad's ruins, a photographer captured the aftermath. A row of Soviet tanks idling in snow, their engines still running, exhaust curling into the gray sky. He titled the photo, "They Breathed." Back in the Urals, that image was passed from hand to hand. Some smiled, others wept. For the first time since the evacuation began, they could see what motion had achieved. The wind over the steppe sounded softer that night. Smoke rose straight into still air. And through the hum of engines fading into distance, the world seemed, briefly, to hold its breath. April 1943, Chelyabinsk, Ural Industrial Basin. Morning light fell pale through the haze of smoke. The air shimmered above the furnaces, a horizon of fire and frost in equal measure. The war had turned, but the rhythm remained. The trains no longer fled. They carried victory westward. Convoys rolled from Tankograd toward the front, their cargo heavy with faith and noise. Inside the factories, the tempo changed again. Not faster, deeper. Each strike of the hammer, each flash of the torch carried a weight of memory. The workers no longer built to survive. They built to finish what survival had made possible. Every face lined with soot and purpose, every gesture deliberate, almost sacred. A new poster hung above the main foundry. Every tank is a letter home. It wasn't propaganda, it was truth. The line between front and rear had blurred. Men who built by day now drove trains by night, delivering engines and tracks through mountain passes. Their calloused hands touched both creation and war. Records from the Soviet Industrial Bureau note output maintained at 100 units monthly, waste reduced by 18%, worker absence negligible, numbers only. Yet between those lines lay devotion. A machinist named Pyotr wrote in his ledger, "I no longer hear the hammers strike, only the echo that follows." That echo filled every space, a reminder of how far they had come. The engineers at Uralvagonzavod refined new methods, rolling armor plates on mobile rigs, assembling turrets inside modified train cars. Their motto, not factory to train, but train as factory. Innovation born of exhaustion, but powered by faith. Outside, spring thawed the rivers. Steam rose from melting snow as if the earth exhaled. Children returned to play near the rail yards, drawing tanks and soot with sticks. One girl traced a locomotive and whispered, "Papa works inside that one." The war still devoured distance, but here the sense of place had returned. The Urals, once wilderness, had become the anvil of victory. Every sunset painted the sky with iron dust. Every dawn revealed silhouettes of cranes, like arms raised in salute to the east. The same rails that had carried despair now carried destiny. From time to time, the factory loudspeakers played music, a violin piece recorded before the war. It was barely audible above the machinery, but some swore it softened the sound of steel. At dusk, a whistle cut through the air, the signal for a completed batch. Engines thundered to life, and the ground trembled under their combined breath. One woman, Irina, the rail clerk from the evacuation logs, still kept her notebook. Its pages yellowed, corners burned, but on the last line she wrote, "Train 168 returned west. Cargo, victory in progress." The convoy departed that night. tanks chained to flat cars, headlights piercing fog that glowed with furnace light. Smoke rose behind them in graceful columns, part exhaust, part offering. As the wheels turned, sparks trailed beneath the cars like falling stars. The noise was endless, yet beautiful, the mechanical hymn of a people who refused to stop. And when the train disappeared into the darkness, the echo lingered, a pulse of iron fading into wind, into silence, into something that sounded almost like peace. The night closed around Tankograd once more. Furnaces dimmed, cranes stood still. But somewhere within that stillness, a single engine kept idling, as if unwilling to let the world forget its rhythm. For those who built, for those who fell, for those whose hands shaped the moving city of steel, the song of the rails would never truly end. July 1943. The Kursk salient, Western Russia. Dust replaced snow. Fields that had once been frozen wasteland now blazed with sunlight. The air shimmered over the steppe, and beneath it, the ground trembled. From the east came a sound the Germans had begun to dread, the steady rolling thunder of T-34s. Engines tuned in the Urals, armor forged in the breath of Magnitogorsk. Each tank a moving fragment of the factories that had refused to die. The Battle of Kursk began before dawn. An ocean of armor collided with an ocean of will. Grass burned black. Smoke rolled low, thick enough to hide the horizon. German radio intercepts called it the storm that would not end. They were right. The Soviet counterattack was not a moment. It was the sound of years of endurance arriving all at once. Each tank bore markings from its birthplace: Chelyabinsk, Nizhny Tagil, Uralvagonzavod. Some crews wrote their factory's name in chalk beside their own. Built in motion, built to return. A gunner recalled later, "When we moved, the ground sounded like a factory floor. Every shot fired was an echo of a hammer strike. Every explosion the rhythm of a press machine. The battlefield became a living extension of the rails." Records show the Soviets fielded nearly 3,000 tanks that week. Many still carried the chalk sigils from their builders. Simple lines and circles, symbols of unseen hands. Those hands had not vanished. They were here, in every turn of the track and roar of the engine. Smoke curled through the valleys, like the memory of the Urals themselves. The same smoke that once rose from furnaces now drifted from cannon barrels, woven into history. A German commander wrote in his diary, "The Russians fight as if the ground itself manufactures them." He wasn't far from truth. The ground, the rails, the fire, all had become one organism of resistance. Through that week of thunder, many T-34s never stopped moving. Crews refueled under fire. Repairs were done on the field. Welders crouched beside smoldering armor, hands steady despite the blasts. They worked as if back in Chelyabinsk, their movements guided by the same rhythm of repetition. No words, only gestures, a shared language born of factories and survival. When the smoke cleared, the plains were littered with wrecks and silence. But the advance did not stop. The war itself had changed direction, westward now, toward the cities that once seemed unreachable. At Tankograd, the news arrived in fragments, numbers first, then names. A telegram pinned to the wall read, "Kursk held, counteroffensive successful, output vindicated, glory to labor." No parades, no speeches, only a new whistle, calling the night shift to begin again. Victory demanded continuity. The rails still hummed. That evening, workers stood outside the factory gates. The sun dipped behind the smokestacks, turning the air to copper. Someone played a harmonica, a few quiet notes swallowed by distance. No applause followed, only silence, soft, full, and earned. A woman touched the soot-streaked wall and whispered, "It's coming home." She meant the war. She meant her son. She meant the sound that had left these rails and now returned through the echo of triumph. Far away, in the ruins of a captured village, a T-34 sat cooling in the dusk. Its engine clicked softly as it cooled, metal contracting like a sigh. On its turret, under layers of dust and grime, the faint white stripe was still visible. Ura's mark, unbroken. The rails had carried the war east. Now they carried it back. And for the first time since that night in Kharkov, the horizon glowed not with retreat, but with return. December 1904, Eastern Poland. The rails that once fled east now pointed toward home. Snow fell heavy again, the same as it had in 41, but this time the trains were full of armor, not evacuation. The war had turned its breath around. Convoys rumbled across the Vistula, steam rising in long, ghostly ribbons. Each locomotive bore the scars of years, dented, blackened, still alive. Behind them, the factories of the Urals kept breathing, their smoke feeding the horizon like a second dawn. From these rails came everything that still moved. Engines tuned in Chelyabinsk, hulls welded in Nizhny Tagil, hands shaped by frost and fire. They had become one vast organism of motion, a river of iron flowing west. Inside a supply train, a mechanic kept a notebook. Each page marked not production numbers, but names: Kharkov, Kursk, Stalingrad, Warsaw. He left the last line blank. He didn't know yet what came next, only that the rails would find it. Along the routes, children waved at the passing convoys. They saw not machines, but home returning on wheels. Somewhere in the wind, one could almost hear the echo of the first evacuation whistles, the same tone, reversed in meaning. At Tankograd, the furnaces still burned. Output continued as if the war had no end. The workers had become guardians of momentum. To stop, even in victory, felt dangerous, as if silence might undo everything. A woman named Zenaida, whose letter to her brother never reached him, now stood at the rail platform overseeing a new shipment. Her hair silvered by smoke, her hands scarred, she whispered to the tanks as they rolled past, "Bring them back." And some did. The first returning trains carried men instead of machines. Soldiers stepped down onto the same platforms where years earlier the factories had departed. They looked older than the rails themselves, but their eyes carried something the East had forged, the calm weight of endurance fulfilled. Reports from the State Defense Committee, February 1945, note, Ural industrial districts remain at peak capacity. Cumulative tank production exceeds 50,000 units. Strategic balance achieved. Behind those numbers lay millions of hands, some still working, some long gone. At night, the sound of engines no longer meant fear. It was memory. The rumble of trains became the nation's lullaby. The sound of persistence outlasting despair. One final convoy departed Chelyabinsk in March. It carried not tanks, but tools, lathes, presses, foundry molds. The same machines that had once fled west now returned home, their metal faces pitted, worn smooth by years of survival. Workers stood in silence as the train left. Steam billowed around them, and for the first time in 4 years, the air smelled of spring rather than smoke. In the distance, thunder rolled, not artillery, but weather. The sound felt different now. It no longer meant loss. When Berlin fell weeks later, the news reached the Urals by telegraph. The message was simple: war concluded, production to stand down. No one spoke. Some wept quietly. Others kept working until the shift bell rang. A photographer captured that moment. Women at their stations, hands still on levers, faces lit by the dying glow of the furnaces. He titled it, "After the Motion." Outside, snow melted from the rails. Grass began to show through ash. The trains stood silent, their wheels gleaming under weak sunlight. A boy walked between them, fingers tracing letters carved long ago. Let the train sleep only when the war sleeps. And so it did. Steam drifted into still air, turning white against the sky. The last whistle blew, long and low, and the sound lingered. A farewell, a benediction. A memory of movement turned to peace. For those who had built the moving cities of steel, victory was not noise or triumph. It was stillness, the quiet hum of a world that could finally rest. And in that silence, the rails shone like mirrors, reflecting the sky that had waited 4 long years to be blue again.